doesn't. So the recording is just starting now. So a big welcome to Nick Huray from Guernsey. He's going to be talking to us about his new book, which came out in May, Tides of Defiance, about the escapes in the Channel Islands. So Nick, an opportunity for you now to introduce yourself to people and tell us a bit about the background to the book. And in particular, I think, give us a feel for the context around the German occupation of the Channel Islands.
Yeah, sure. So I was born in Guernsey slightly over 50 years ago. I've lived here all my life, although worked away, but based here. Um, I'm an accountant by trade, which is quite a useful skill, being in order to have when researching. To be fair, and I started researching this book probably about 5 years ago. I mentioned it to a friend of mine who unfortunately is no longer with us, and he absolutely thought I should go and write this book. And I started gathering information around it. I have a huge personal archive of documentation relating to the occupation. And one of the things that kind of spurred me on to do this was attending the We Have Ways festival organised by Al Murray and James Holland, and talking to people, and they didn't really know an awful lot about the occupation of the Channel Islands, other than they'd seen a couple of TV documentaries and things like that. And a lot of people were saying, oh, you should do something with all this information you've got. And I was like, no, I'm too busy, haven't got time, far too busy. And I kind of got my arm twisted into writing a blog, because that was easier than writing a book and didn't take much time, apparently. Yeah, that took quite a bit of time. So I do have a blog, islandfortress.com. Then I got involved in a podcast with another chap from Guernsey, talking about month by month about how the occupation took place, how the social impacts of it. We thought it was important to cover how people felt, how, what were their personal feelings, how did the interactions with the Germans impact on them, as well as the military aspects as well, of course. And then I fell to writing the book eventually, having been persuaded that that's what I really should do with all of this information that I'd gathered. I had quite a bit of information about escapes. I didn't realise that I was missing probably about 40%. There were a couple of lists kicking around of Channel Island escapes, which kind of indicated there were about 190-ish people that had attempted or had actually escaped. I found at least another 25, potentially some more, but unfortunately I can't prove those ones as yet. Trying to get the information is a little bit tricky, shall we say.
And so just give us a little bit of context, Nick, around why the Channel Islands was so important for the Germans to occupy, because it was the only part of the British Isles that was occupied during the Second War. But why was Hitler so obsessed by the Channel Islands?
He became obsessed with it because, I mean, it's completely daft, because even the British, as far back as 1925, had decided that the islands were strategically really of no use, and bizarrely the country that was most likely to invade the Channel Islands was their ally, the French, who they've been fighting the First World War with. There's cabinet papers on that, which I've read, and you think, okay, yeah, but they still maintained a garrison here right up until a couple of weeks before the Germans arrived, but they really weren't. We weren't of any strategic importance. Most sane military leaders in the German Navy, the German Army, would agree that it was completely pointless. It was just basically a big PR coup. Hitler got very excited when he found out that he could easily occupy part of Britain as far as he saw it, and he saw it as a prelude to Operation Sea Lion, the operation that never took place in the end, which was the idea that he was going to invade England. it was used. They filmed here for PR to try and make it look as though it wasn't going to be that bad, and maybe England should think about surrendering. You know, we're jolly nice, really, and being occupied wouldn't be that bad. Um, that was in the very very early stages of the occupation, and then he just became obsessed. Once he got British soil, I'm not giving that up, even though it made absolutely no sense to pour huge amounts of resources into the Channel Islands. About 10% of the concrete in the Atlantic Wall, which, when you bear in mind that runs from Norway all the way down to Spain, that's just absolutely bonkers for, particularly you've got Guernsey's 25 square miles, Jersey's about 45, and you've got tiny little Albany, and you're holding these for what reason? Just for PR, really. It's just crazy.
And I suppose the reverse was true, wasn't it? Because the islands were actually not liberated until the day after the unconditional surrender was signed in Northwest Europe. So the reverse was true, that the Brits realized that actually there was no real military strategic value in wasting people and retaking the islands.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they did try and persuade the Germans to surrender in September of '44. They actually took a decision at Supreme Allied headquarters that they would send somebody here to try and secure a surrender, which you would have thought by that point any sane person, when you've been completely cut off for 3 months from getting supplies, would think, it's a bit all over, because everyone, Somalia had fallen by then. That the Allies had made their way well down the French coast there. Why would you continue? But that failed, and the Allies just looked at him, basically went, well, we've got a prisoner of war camp that we don't have to guard effectively, which has got 30,000 armed forces personnel from the enemy. So let's just not. I mean, the other thing was, when you look at the plans that they had, if they had to take the islands back by force, it would have been horrific for the civilian population, and that's almost certainly why those never took place, because they were talking about bombing the islands for 3 days with 700 bombers a day. I mean, you know the islands as well, Rupert.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to hide.
There would have been carnage. There would have been a
It,
lot of civilian casualties, definitely.
yeah, absolutely. And if you ended up in a ground war, you just would have had huge military casualties as well. I mean, one of the crazy things was Mountbatten referred to one of the plans that they came up with for potentially retaking Jersey, where they were going to land on one side of the island, well, land on two sides of the island, and then go across the island to meet up, as being just like Dieppe. I mean, who would have thought that was a good idea, to be honest? I mean, let's face facts. A little bit crazy.
Yeah. So before we get back into your book, is it worth just touching on the commando raids that took place in the islands, which again was not necessarily the Brits wanting strategically to retake the islands, but more Churchill just wanting to be annoying, and also in the early days of the war, wanting to make the Germans realize that they were in for a fight?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. Excuse me. Very much so. I mean, Hubert Nicoll came back a matter of just over a week after Guernsey had been occupied, and he was sent by Churchill to come back and find out how many Germans were here, what was going on, and gather some intelligence, which he did successfully, and went back. But there were other commando raids throughout the war. I mean, some of them were disastrous, frankly. Operation Ambassador, they ended up not achieving anything. The idea was to try and grab some Germans to take them away for intelligence. They didn't succeed in doing that. They ended up leaving some men behind. Churchill himself said, let's not have any more fiascos like that. And then 3 months later, he's got another commando raid going on in the Channel Islands. I mean, it's just completely bonkers. They have other things like Operation Dryad, where they go and attack the Casquets lighthouse. there are various commando raids. They have multiple reasons for having them. So some of them are to scope out whether there is any chance that they could retake the islands and ways that they could do that. Then you've got Operation Basalt, where they go to Sark and they're looking to find information. They want to grab some Germans and succeed in doing so, not without causing massive problems, because that's one of the things that causes the commando order. You get Operation Hardtack 7, again Sark. Unfortunately, they take the same route as Operation Basalt and find themselves in the middle of a minefield, and that is a complete and utter disaster. So kind of a mixed bag on the commando raids, but it is. You can listen to interviews with some of the Germans that are held on the Imperial War Museum archives, and they talk about being terrified about being out on patrol on their own, stood on a headland in the dark, wondering if someone's just going to come and grab them or kill them.
Well, especially with Anders Larsen
Yes, he
on
was
the
on.
prowl.
Exactly, he was on Basalt, and he was also due to do another raid, which just got called off due to bad weather, where they're going to try and sink shipping in St. Peterborough Harbour.
But anyway, let's turn to the book, because that's the main reason for the discussion today. You just touched slightly earlier on the inspiration behind the book. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Who was it? One particular person who
Yeah, so
really drove you to do this?
I'm a gentleman called Colin Fallais, who we only met in person a very few times. He lived here in Guernsey, but he was a keen radio ham and into CB radio, and also was quite prolific on social media. And he would quite often contact me and say, "Oh, I'd mentioned one of the times that I did meet him. I mentioned that I was thinking about writing this book, but hadn't really said anything. And after about 2 months, I'd not really said any more about it. And he started chivying me up and then giving me some ideas of people that I could talk to that might know some things a little bit more than had been written in the past. Because most that had been written about it in the past was an article from the mid-70s which just gave about a paragraph on a couple of the escapes, probably about 5 or 6 of the escapes, not anything else. So he just chivied me up. Sadly, Colin died a little while ago, so wasn't around to see the book finished. But various other people have encouraged me along the way. My friend Alistair Davidson has been most helpful in just applying a bit of logic to things when I've been banging my head against a brick wall as to where I might find some more information. He's been a great help, as well as Pierre Renier from the Occupation Society in Feston, Guernsey, and one of the other tour guides, Tim Osborne, was most helpful as well, because one of his family members was involved in one of the escapes.
Well, I suppose the obvious question is, how long did it take you to write the book? Was this a matter of years, matter of months?
It took me about 3 years. I did have a period of illness through that, where about 6 months where I couldn't really write. So, but I think my top tip for anybody who's thinking about doing this is try and do all the research, as much research as possible first before you start writing. But that said, I'm in the very lucky position that I frequently go on Radio Guernsey and Radio Jersey, usually about once a month, to do a little history slot. And occasionally it's been mentioned that I'm writing this book, and then people get in touch, or somebody will see some a social media post, and so more and more stuff keeps coming out of the woodwork, because they'll say, "Oh, hang on a minute, did you know I've actually got some letters that so-and-so wrote after they'd escaped?" So you never know when things are going to stop coming out of the woodwork. I mean, even I came across some stuff last week after the book had been published, which unexpectedly somebody said to me, "Oh, did you know about this?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I didn't." Also, I've had people contact me to say, I know that I've got a relative who lives in Australia who's got some information. He's looking for it. He can't remember what he's done with it. He thinks it's in his loft, um, but it ties back. That one in particular ties back to one that is a possible, because I've got a little bit of information, but just not enough. The facts this chap was able to give me tied in with some other information that I had, but just not enough to know who the people were exactly and get any more information. So yeah, it's always interesting doing that.
And a really good top tip there about research. I thought that was really, really well made point. But what was the most fun thing about writing it? And I suppose on the flip side, what was the most tricky or boring or difficult bit?
I think one of the fun things was just people getting in touch, really, or when I got in touch with somebody that I'd had a tip off might know about an escape, and they'd say, "Oh, I'll come and meet you for a coffee, and I'll bring some stuff with me," and you just never knew. I mean, you might go for a coffee with them or pop round to see them, and think they're going to have 1 or 2 pages of letters and they turn up with like a lever arch file full of stuff. I mean, one of my top tips is, if you get given stuff like that, is don't sit there reading it. Take photographs of it all and read it afterwards. Same for when you go to an archive, because otherwise you get distracted. And you just don't get all the information that you need, and we're all guilty of it. I've done it in the past. You disappear off down a rabbit hole, and don't achieve what you want. Last time I went to Kew, I spent the best part of a day there, and I took 1,500 photographs, and then read them afterwards.
Yeah.
I went through them afterwards, because that was definitely the way to go. That was a tip that was given to me by James Holland. He said, whatever you do, don't sit there reading stuff. So I think the research was fun, but the meeting relatives of those that had escaped, or people that had got in touch with me, who knew of people that had escaped and had information, that was really fun. The bit that was the worst bit, I don't know, was just trying to stitch the stories together in a way that worked in the book, and trying to decide how I was going to approach it. I couldn't put every story in either as well. That was the other difficulty, because there are just too many for one book. It was just really that nobody really written about it before. There was a book about some of the Jersey escapes that was written in I think it was the 1990s, but that didn't have an awful lot of information. It was very brief about a lot of the escapes. So so I think just the actual writing it bit was probably the trickiest.
Okay. Absolutely. And I think you've given my next question was going to be around top tips, but I think you've been great in sharing what worked for you during the process you were researching and writing the book.
I've got another top tip, which I really should have thought of much, much earlier. A friend, Jenny O'Brien, has written many books, and I really should have spoken to her a lot earlier in the process, rather than a few months from completing it. And that was really a schoolboy error.
Well, we've all made them, Nick. I certainly did when I was going through a similar process. Um, so you mentioned earlier about being an accountant, and how do you think the skills you've acquired through your trade or your profession helped you researching the book? What in particular made it easier or more difficult for you as an accountant to wade through all this information?
Yeah, I think spending the best part of 36 years as an auditor, trying to understand how things worked, and also acting as a liquidator and piecing things together from various records and finding out exactly what had happened. I think that really stood me in good stead for an approach on actually gathering the information. Occasionally, like I say, I hit a brick wall and just had to speak to somebody and say, what do you think? they'd say, "What have you thought about this?" I mean, the one thing I would say is the folks at the Island Archives in Guernsey, Jersey's archives as well. They're absolutely brilliant, really, really helpful. They gave up asking why some of my very random requests. They just thought, oh well, it's him again. But because initially they'd be like, oh, that's very interesting. Why do you want to know about that? But some of the more bizarre requests, like, do you have the harbour logs from X date to Y date? Perhaps stumped them a little bit, and they didn't bother. They didn't bother asking why I wanted to know that.
Yeah, so resilience and persistence definitely traits you need when you're writing your first book.
Yeah, absolutely. That's you, particularly if you if you've got a really what is shaping up to be a really interesting escape, and you start running out of information. It's just like, what if I can't find anything else? Thankfully, that didn't in the end happen for the ones that are in the book. There were a couple that didn't make it into the book purely because there just wasn't enough. It looked like it was going to be a really interesting escape, but there just wasn't enough to make sure that what I was going to be able to write was factually correct and was from decent sources, not 20-second hand from somebody else.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the escapes themselves, of which, and I've obviously I worked with you on the manuscript. I can't remember exactly how many there are, but which of those escapes really sticks out in your mind as an inspiring experience or story? Which one out of all the
Um,
escapes you wrote about really sticks out as the one that
that
is inspirational?
that's really difficult. I suppose the obvious one is probably a well-known one, so I'm not probably giving too many spoilers away with mentioning Dennis Vibert from Jersey, because not only does he attempt to escape once and row quite a long distance, he then proceeds to row all the way around Guernsey from Jersey, so pretty much the longest way round you could attempt. Now, he wasn't intending to row. He just had some incredible bad luck with engines, but his story is incredible. There is another one as well, which a lot of people have been surprised about when I mentioned it, which is the two Americans that escaped from the prisoner of war camp in Jersey. Because most people say, there was a prisoner of war camp in Jersey. This is their first reaction, because they had absolutely no idea that there was a prisoner of war camp in Jersey. For anybody from Jersey that's on the Zoom, it was at Snow Hill. There's very little left. I believe there's just a little bit of the toilet block that's left on the site now, which is quite apt for the escape. But I mean, the two Americans that escaped then. Anybody who decides to escape in January 1945, when the weather is absolutely appalling, that's just inspirational. They have so many close scrapes, shall we say. The weather initially helps them, but they have so many close scrapes. They're assisted a lot by locals. But yeah, that's just an incredible one. Some of the stuff that they get up to, it's quite an inspiration.
And Nick, I think this comes across well in the book, but for the benefit of the people who are here tonight, can you talk a little bit about what it was like to live under German occupation? Because I think, if I understand this correctly, there were certain phases, weren't there, of the
Yeah.
occupation? Do you want to just talk and just give people a feel for what it was like to be occupied by the Germans?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the early days were. I hesitate to use the word model occupation, but they were trying to behave well for the reasons that I outlined before. They wanted to use it as a propaganda exercise, maybe try and use it to use these propaganda films to get the British to consider surrendering or coming to some arrangement. as time went on, things got worse, not least because the changes in command, both here and in the north of France, because the north of France was responsible for what was going on here. You also have the changes in personnel in the Channel Islands make for a very different experience. Shortages of food as well. Everybody thinks about the winter of 44 as being particularly bad, but the winter of 43 is arguably just as bad or possibly even worse at certain points. You have people that are dying of malnutrition by 1941 due to the rationing. There are so many orders by about, I think it was in early 1942, a chap called Philip Lesota in Jersey, who was the manager of a builders merchants. He writes in his diary that there are so many orders that he's convinced that if all of the things that he'd done on he'd done on his own, he would not be able to serve enough time before he died. And he was quite a young man. He was like, if they sentenced me for every rule of theirs that I've broken, I'd be dead before I'd served all the sentences. And he was in his 20s at that point. There's a crazy amount of orders. The list I've got is something like 843 different orders that come out during the course of the occupation. They just control every aspect of your life, basically. They take away the radios permanently in June 41. Sorry, things are just not going well from the point of view of having stuff to do. You can't obviously get new books or anything like that. People are swapping books around, but the libraries see a massive uptake. But lots of amateur dramatics and things like that spring up just because people have got very little else to do apart from go to work. But I'm still amazed at the amount of sport that gets played, given that people are, even when people are starving, they still make the effort to try and play sports. It's incredible.
Yeah, and it was hearing what you're saying, Nick. I mean, it kind of sounds as though it was a similar to a prisoner of war camp. To the
Mm.
things that the POWs. I know we got Bill Robertson on the call here who wrote the Undefeated, but there's some similarities
Yeah,
between
very
the
much so.
civilian population here in Channel Islands and the people who are incarcerated in prisoner of war camps in Europe, how they pass their time as well.
Yeah, absolutely, very, very similar. But I guess with the added complication of getting supplies for the civilian population, particularly as the Allies ramped up towards D-Day. So by the middle of 43, they're harassing any shipping that's in the area. It's the Germans use it as a convenient excuse for why supplies are not getting through and why Red Cross messages perhaps are getting lost. They blame it on the Allies. It's an easy one to do.
And what about the rather vexed question about collaboration with the Germans? That was quite a tricky subject, certainly post-war, wasn't it? Was there a lot of collaboration, and how was that dealt with when the islands got liberated? What was the outcome of that? Were people punished for it who collaborated?
It depends what you mean by punished. I mean, you've got to look at it. It's very difficult to look at these things with modern values versus what people were going through at the time. And in fact, I was in Jersey a couple of weeks ago, and I went to Jersey War Tunnels. And one of the things that I think that they've got there that is absolutely brilliant is they've got a section with the "What would you do?" and they've got these sort of models with German speaking, and you get different scenarios and things like that, and it really makes people think about it. But I mean, it depends what you mean by collaboration. You
Well,
know, is
so there were secret radios that people had. They were listening
yeah,
to the BBC World Service post, I think it said June 1941. And obviously there were people, as the war progressed and food became more scarce, there was a black market,
yeah. Oh,
no
the black
doubt.
market was rife. Yeah,
And no doubt that led to opportunities for people to betray other people in order to get reward from the Germans.
yeah,
Which, I think you touched on it. The war tunnels in Jersey have got this thing which says, what would you do? You are starving, your children are starving, and you become aware that one of your neighbors has got an illicit radio, and you know that if you tell the Germans obliquely that there's an illicit radio there, you're going to get some food for your
yeah.
children and for
Pot- pot-
yourself.
yeah, potentially. I mean, the, there were some overt collaborators that really just were very blatant about it. There was a lady in Jersey who actually had to be put into prison come the liberation. Her and her son, for their own protection, they were put into prison before they were made to leave the island. Um, I guess it comes at varying degrees. But there was a lot of defiance as well. I call it defiance. It's sort of small acts of resistance. We couldn't have resistance where you're going around blowing stuff up because A, you didn't have the stuff to go and blow it up, but B, you're stuck on, in Guernsey's case, stuck on an island of 25 square miles with no little opportunity to get away from the island, and a huge garrison. I mean, it was like one German for every three at one point. You had a little opportunity, but there were acts of sabotage. There were various things like you mentioned the radios being confiscated. You had the Guernsey Underground News Service guns who produced illicit news sheets. You had GASP, Guernsey Active Secret Press, who did the same things. The guys from Guns were betrayed. Again, in Jersey, you had various different people who were, particularly towards the end of the war, were trying to stir up disillusioned Germans to actually lead some sort of a revolt. There's all sorts of things going on, but obviously not for we had no weapons, so you didn't have that. But there were acts of what you could call varying levels of collaboration to get things. Do you think collaboration is just accepting a gift from a German soldier, which means that you're going to be able to feed your children? I mean, the Reverend Douglas Ord, in his diaries, talks about a German that he becomes friendly with, a chap called Reinhold. Now, he'd actually been locked up in Germany for disagreeing with the government before he'd been drafted into the forces. And him and Ord get on very well, and he brings Ord bread when he can from the German supplies. But they meet and talk about all sorts that's going on, both back in Germany, and is that collaboration that he brings him bread when he comes to talk to him about what's going on? Is who knows. It's very difficult. But then you have got people who just are basically profiteering. They're in it for the money, and they're in it to ingratiate themselves with the Germans. I mean, the guys from Guns were betrayed by an Irishman who did it for the money. He's possibly Frank Fallon never names him in his book. I do know who it was. He is, as far as I'm aware, the only person that is actually identified in German papers as being a fully paid informant rather than some sort of ad hoc reward for dobbing somebody in.
Mm. And what happened to him at the end of the war? Was he still on the island or not?
I don't know what happened to him. I've not
Yeah.
been able to trace that. But there were various others from predominantly from Jersey actually, who were caught up in things, who were in prison in Jersey, usually English people in prison in Jersey when the Germans arrived, who got made to go and do stuff in Germany. Some of them did face trial after the war. A lady called Pearl Varden, who moved to Germany with a German officer and then did propaganda broadcasts. was caught post-war, and so it's varying levels of things. I mean, certainly in Guernsey, people have long memories. So some of the people who were overt collaborators, who were out to make loads and loads of money, even when I was a youngster in the 70s and early 80s, there'd be people that would be talked about like, oh no, I'm not doing business with him because of he did this, and that's a long time after the war. You're talking, 35 years after the war. So, yeah, it's a difficult one, and
Yeah.
who knows? I mean, you just don't know. You can't possibly put yourself in the shoes of the exact circumstances of anybody at the time. I mean, I think you probably can say the people that were just in it for the money and were blatantly profiteering and made lots of money out of it and got to keep that money post-war. Yeah, okay, that's definitely collaboration. But anybody else that did low-level stuff to get food so their family didn't starve, bearing in mind people were dying, unless you know the exact circumstances, how can you possibly?
Yeah.
I just don't know.
I think that's a very balanced perspective on it, Nick. I agree with you. So just moving back again to the escapes. So what happened to the people who did escape when they got to the mainland? Were they welcomed with open arms? Did they? I appreciate they were probably debriefed by the intelligence authorities, but what happened to them? Did they want to go back to the islands after the war, or did they want to stay in the UK?
It's kind of a mixed bag, really. So you end up with the really early escapes. They rock up in England, and the authorities haven't really kind of thought about what to do. If I think they just kind of forgotten about us from that aspect. So they get varying receptions. So you get some that just end up having to have a chat with a local copper, and they might, they're given a cup of tea and a sandwich and whatever, and allowed to go on their way the next day. Usually to go and find friends and family who've been evacuated, etc. You've got some that get a little bit more. They describe again on the early escapes of, oh, we were interrogated by a naval officer. It kind of depends where they pitch up. If they pitch up somewhere like Dartmouth, then they're going to get a lot more of a grilling. But even then, they still didn't really kind of know what to do with these people. Are they spies? Some of them didn't speak English; they spoke patois. And they've got funny names. Anyways, so later on in the war, MI19 was set up, and that was an excellent resource for anybody who's trying to find out, what went on with these escapes, because they were interviewed. I must say that it is quite an indicator of the times that any women that escaped were generally asked about food, the other domestic activities, and what happened if the Germans caught, shall we say, a social disease, and very little else, even though they might have had quite a lot of knowledge about what was going on in terms of fortifications. And then you see the men from the same escape, but their interviews, it's all about, well, what have you seen in the way of fortifications? How many Germans, where, and whatever. But they just a sign of the times, I guess. But then you also get some of the, what I'd say, are top quality escapers, where you get some of the ones later on in the war who have basically drawn maps of German positions and things like that. I've got copies of them, and they're handing over a map of a German gun battery because they've been sent there to go and do some work, and they've scoped the place out and done very detailed drawings, details of the harbour defences, all that kind of stuff. So it varies in terms of the amount of information that they get, but some of it's a real insight into quite how things, why they went. I mean, I think one of the most British reasons for escape was one of the ones that happened in September 1940, and the straw that broke the camel's back was all over a cup of tea. I mean, how British is that? I mean, he decided, I'm going to risk life and limb because he was a bit annoyed about a cup of tea.
And what about the families of the escapers who were left behind? What happened to them? Were there reprisals by the Germans? Once the Germans had worked out that people had escaped, did they target their families?
Yeah, there were a few that were lucky. The Germans just assumed they were lost at sea. Not very many of those. But yeah, there were, I can think of one in particular where the elderly parents of one of the escapers were dragged out of their bed and taken for questioning and held for a number of days, even though they knew nothing about the escape. It tended to be more about unless they knew you were definitely involved, then you probably got off with a bit of interrogation. It was more about the wider, and I talk about this quite a lot in the book, the wider impact on the population. Fishing getting banned. I mean, the Germans do that several times, despite the fact that after a few weeks the first time, they realise that's a really bad idea because they need people to go fishing to feed their own garrison, let alone the civilian population. But they still ban it. They put stupid restrictions on some of the fishing as well. One of my favourites is in Sark. When they first put severe restrictions on fishing, it was clearly a German officer that came up with the rules in Sark, who had never been anywhere near the sea, because they put up a sign which basically said that fishing, from memory, it was allowed from 10 till 4 every day. Well, you only have to know that the tide moves, and you can't. He was puzzled why nobody turned up to go fishing for about a week. It's because because there's no point because the tide's all wrong. And eventually they had to relent and change that. But so there were big implications like that. Other things like cutting rations, various other things. So the attitude of the local population changes throughout the war as well, because it's you get people early on who think, well, they've run away, what a bunch of cowards, they've left us to face the music. And then you've got other people who think, well, good on them, they got one over on Jerry. And that attitude, the government here, the civilian government in both islands is going mad, going, please don't do this, because they're having enough trouble trying to manage, particularly in the early days, trying to manage the Germans as it is, walking a tightrope of trying to minimise the impact of anything nasty that they might do. And it's like an escape really doesn't help that sort of thing. So then they're initially, well, no, we can't condone this. Please don't do it. There's notices in the papers and things like that. But of course, as things get more and more desperate, as the war progresses, you're then getting, well, there are at least 2 in Guernsey officially sanctioned escapes where they are actively helped by members of the government and other high-ranking officials here, including the medical officer of health here in Guernsey, who writes a report which they take with them. Various other people write detailed observations on what's going on. If those guys have been caught with that, a large chunk of the people that were trying to keep the island running and trying to mitigate what the Germans were doing would have ended up in massive trouble and probably deported to Germany.
That's quite a nice segue into, and you did talk a little bit earlier about the different phases of the occupation, but can you just describe a bit about how it must have felt to have been on the islands in the winter of 1944-45, when the Allies had invaded mainland France, and so France had been liberated, but the Channel Islands still hadn't, and as we said earlier, wasn't liberated until the day after the surrender in Northwest Europe. Can you just
Yeah,
describe what it must have been like? And I think there was a Red Cross ship that came in. Maybe talk a little bit about that,
yeah,
but just
sure.
try and describe what it was like to live through that last winter under
Yeah,
occupation.
sure. I mean, so initially when D-Day happened, of course they could see, particularly at night, the explosions, the flashes from explosions. They could hear the gunfire, they could hear the bombing, see all the aircraft, and all that was going on. And initially everyone's really excited about, well, they'll be coming for us next. Brilliant. We're going to be living. And then after about 3 weeks, it turns to despair because it's like, they're not coming. Oh, now what do we do? And then you've also got the fact that you're worrying about, well, what do the Germans here do if they get desperate? They've got the civilian population. Do they start? What do they use them as a bargaining chip? Do they go bonkers and kill them, or what happens? You cut off from supplies. It's very, very difficult to get any supplies here. So people start to starve. There's various attempts to get the Red Cross to come. Churchill won't allow it. He writes very famously, "Let them starve," on the bottom of a cabinet paper in September 1944. Now, there's every historian loves an argument about, did he mean the civilian population? Did he mean the Germans? Did he mean both? Who knows? I've got some thoughts on that, which I've included in the book, as to what my viewpoint is on from having looked at various different sources. But yeah, the protecting power of Switzerland is as far as the local government here is concerned. They've tried to contact them. Then the Germans go a bit coy about whether they actually sent the letter that was supposed to go to Switzerland. Then they eventually blame the Allies and say that it was bombed, but it seems in all probability the letter never went anywhere because they didn't want anybody to find out quite how bad things here were, because they were actually starting to get worried that when it all went wrong, they were going to be in big trouble. So eventually, partly because of one of the escapes, then the green light is given for the Red Cross to come. So the Vega turns up in December, the end of December, 44 in Guernsey, and then goes on to Jersey, makes a number of trips. The civilian population do get these Red Cross parcels, predominantly from Canada and New Zealand, and that helps them to survive. Without a doubt, many, many more would have died if that hadn't happened. The Germans respected those. There were problems with people trying to sell stuff from Red Cross parcels, and quite heavy sanctions were put in place. But the Germans, as far as records would indicate, did not interfere with the parcels themselves, even though they were starving themselves. Ironically, Hofmeier, who was the commandant, who was an ardent Nazi, he was the commandant in early 45. He actually had 3 months' worth of supplies that he wasn't giving to his troops because he was holding out to be rescued. He was preparing for a siege. I mean, he was in a siege anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But and that it was only when liberation came that. In fact, there are cases of Germans who gorged themselves so much on stuff that they found that had been stored away that they actually died from doing that. I can think of at least 3 recorded cases of that.
And what about the escapers? Did they come back to the islands after the war? Did they settle in the UK?
It's a mixed bag. Because some of them already had relatives there. It's a bit like the evacuees. I mean, I had my great aunt was evacuated, never came back. She stayed in the UK. Other relatives that went, my grandmother, she came back, but it's very much similar to that for the escapers. So you had some of them already had ties to the UK and decided to stay. Some of them met a partner there and decided to marry and decided to stay. particularly the ones that escaped early on because they were in the UK for the longest time frame. A lot of them joined the forces um, and went off to fight, and therefore then carried on, in some cases, a military career for many, many years, and then retired to the islands. So it's a very mixed bag.
Yeah, I think that's often forgotten, isn't it? That and even before the Germans arrived on the islands, a lot of Channel Islands men volunteered, went to the
Yeah,
mainland and joined up. A lot of them joined the Royal Hampshire Regiment, where I think they, correct me if I get this wrong, Nick, but I think they even had a dedicated company, didn't they, in
yeah,
one battalion to Channel Islanders. So slightly Great War pals kind of idea that
yeah.
they would keep all.
Which was the whole idea they were trying to avoid. But yeah, I mean, if you look at it, there were just over 10,000 Channel Islanders that signed up. Which, when you think you were looking at about 85,000 in total population pre-war,
Yeah.
that's a hell of a lot. And you've got to take into account as well the First World War had wiped out pretty much a generation for Guernsey. You're already, you're at a disadvantage. So it was a huge percentage of the population, really.
So your book doesn't, you said earlier, your book doesn't cover all of the escapes that took place from the islands. What's next, Nick? Is there more coming, or has doing your book exhausted you in terms of?
I might take a break for a little bit, but I think that break might actually involve doing some more research because I have got quite a few where I've got quite a bit of information. I mentioned it earlier where I just don't have enough just quite yet. And if I can just pull on few strands to actually get that information um, and go looking further for it, then there's every chance that there'll be another one. And anybody from Jersey that's listening, there'll be some more Jersey escapes in there because we're skewed in the book. We're skewed towards Guernsey. There are Jersey escapes in there, but there are some really interesting escapes from Jersey, some of which have been written about quite a bit, which is why I didn't include them in the book.
Yeah,
Um, there are others where I know that I've got some information, and I know other people that have got information on it. So yeah, I, I'm saying I'm taking a break from it, but I'm always researching stuff, and people are always coming to me. I'm very lucky that I've got a lot of contacts in Jersey, a lot of contacts in Germany and the UK who are very, very helpful to me.
excellent. Okay, so kind of watch this space really, and you'll continue with your very successful podcast that you do on the Channel Islands more
Yes,
generally.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, and various other bits. I'm off to France to talk about the occupation in a couple of weeks' time. Going to Manier, which obviously has a link to Guernsey through the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry. So I'm very lucky. I've been invited to go and talk about occupation here versus occupation there. Also talk about escapes from the book and things like that. So I'm really looking forward to doing that.
Will that be in French, Nick?
Some of it might be.
Well done.
No,
Okay.
to be fair, they have offered if I need an interpreter, but which I think may well be the case. But a lot of them, people I'm going to be talking to, speak very good English. Put us to shame with our French.
Yeah.
Quite often, when I speak to people in French, they switch to English after a little while because they just. But
So we got to go on. Sorry, you finish.
so I'm doing that. I'm on BBC Radio Guernsey, BBC Radio Jersey on Sunday, just after 11. What else have I been doing? I'm doing World War Two TV with Paul Woodidge on the 23rd of June. So yeah, loads going
Brilliant.
on really.
And will you be speaking? So Bill Robertson, who's on the call, who wrote The Undefeated, a book on POWs in Germany, he was mentioning that he'd really enjoyed your talk at the We Have Ways.
Hmm.
Are you speaking again this year at
I'm
that?
not speaking again this year. I will be
Yeah.
there this year, but I'm not speaking this year.
Okay.
I figured I'd had my go
Will
last
you
year
will
on.
you have copies of your book to sell if
I'm
people do
sure.
bump into you?
I'm sure if people bump into me, I'll be able to arrange some copies for them.
Okay. And And just to wrap things up, I've got a question here for you from Bill, actually. Question for Nick. Does he think being a local gave him a unique perspective on these stories? Did it make it easier to open doors in terms of access to documents and stories that maybe an outsider wouldn't have come across?
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely the case, and not through any prejudice against an outsider, but merely because being in my mid 50s and having grown up here, I know an awful lot of people, and that helped because obviously if you somebody coming from outside that they don't know, you don't know these people exist. If I see a name in a document, I've got a fighting chance of knowing who to ask if they're related to them and things like that. But equally, I'm frequently very handily the Island Archives is about 5 minutes walk from where I work. And as I say, they're really helpful. I email them and I can just pop along and go and look at stuff. And I know lots of other people. I'm a tour guide as well. I know loads of tour guides. I know lots of people in the Occupation Society, Festa and Guernsey. I've got really good contacts with some people in Jersey as well, who were involved in those sort of things. So I think that makes it really quite easy. Whereas if you're coming in from outside, that said, you get the likes of Duncan Barrett wrote a book about the occupation a few years ago. He came and lived here for a few months, and somebody tipped him off that it might be worth having a word with me in terms of finding a few folk that he might be able to talk to, which I was more than happy to help with. So yeah, definitely an advantage to be a local, just purely because understanding. Also having had family that were here during the occupation, that undoubtedly helped in understanding what went on.
And a final question now, again from Bill. Are you doing any signed copies?
Yeah, if anybody wants a signed copy, if they want to bring it along to We Have Ways if they're going, I'm more than happy to sign it. Or I can send them a book plate if they want a book plate signed. Equally happy to do that.
Okay, and they can get hold of you through Island Fortress, can they?
Yeah, if they go to islandfortress.com, they can find my contact details there, or catch me on social media. I'm fairly prolific on social media.
Okay, great. I don't think there were some questions earlier on about the National Archives where Darren and Bill were sort of exchanging views on photographing stuff. So I think I'm just going to leave that in the sense that they were sort of debating that between themselves. So I don't.
I can pick that one up with them separately. It's fine.
Okay,
I know how to
yeah.
contact both of them.
Okay, great. So I think that's it, Nick. Unless
Brilliant,
anyone has got any other questions they want to drop into the chat box. I'll just give them sort of 10, 15 seconds to try and do that if they'd like to. Well, no, I think no. I think that's
brilliant.
been excellent. Nick, thank you very much. Before we sign off, just a couple of books that are coming out from Barnthorne in the next 2 or 3 months. Rusty Furman, who some of you may have heard of, who was one of the SAS operators who was involved in the embassy siege, has written a story of his life. It's an autobiography, which is he's written 2 books already, one about the siege, but this one covers the whole of his life. So that's coming out fairly soon. And we've got Neil Cherry, who any of you, Arnhem Anoraks, as he calls them, he's written the first volume of a book on the headstones in the Oosterbeek cemetery. If you're on the Arnhem 1944 Fellowship, you'll have seen the Facebook posts where he does, I think it's once every couple of weeks, he does a post on headstones and gives the background of the soldiers who've died. So he's put that together in a book, which we're going to publish in the next couple of months. So watch this space, and I think he'll be at We Have Ways. I think he's talking with Al Murray about that. So if you're at
Excellent,
We Have Ways, you'll have the opportunity to see Neil and pick up a copy there.
brilliant,
But lastly, just say, Neil, Nick, apologies, Nick, thank you very, very much for that. That I found that really, and I did go through with you a couple of times the manuscript, but you even told me stuff tonight that wasn't in the book, which I found really, really helpful, and I'm sure the audience would agree with that. So thanks a lot, and
brilliant.
good luck with your book sales.
Thank you.
Good night,
Cheers.
everyone.